Good evening, this is Mae Brussell. The title of this one-hour broadcast is World Watchers. It's program number 744, March the 10th, 1986. I was up at De Anza College this past week for National Women's Week. I've been going there the past few years and spent an evening with people who listen to World Watchers almost every week. And also David Emery and Nip Tuck. I have a program on KFJC 3 hours a week, similar to the material that I have on World Watchers. It overlaps the content of it. And then they do one program a month called Radio Free America, where they take these various subjects and just talk about them for 3 hours in depth. So being with this audience who are literally saturated with these names and circumstances that interrelate with each other, that seem far apart but connect, it was just a wonderful time to be with all of them. I enjoy it so much, and I enjoyed meeting new people that are radio listeners and old friends, and we'll be getting together soon again. It really is invigorating to see that there are people out there who can absorb and handle this material and grow with it and understand the complexities of it, or if they're not at that stage yet, they're at least willing to listen. I noticed in the San Francisco Chronicle this morning that the person examining the bodies of the dead astronauts to be brought up is none other than Dr. Michael M. Baden from New York City. They described him as being on leave as Deputy City Medical Examiner of New York. He's been under all kinds of questioning for the past 4 or 5 years on questionable homicides, were they murders, not homicides, how he covered up certain murders. He's been involved in many scandals in New York City. So while he's on leave, he's been given the job for NASA, I suppose, to now take care of the autopsy of the astronauts. The important thing about Dr. Biden was he was the chief medical examiner for the House Select Committee on Assassinations. He works for the CIA. He's the one who ordered the cremation of Nelson Rockefeller. He was out at La Costa, California, and you know what that base is, with the mafia modalists and the familiar team that were again involved and named with Robert Mayu in connections with Paul Laxalt to the Kennedy assassination and the Howard Hughes organization. He was out there when Nelson Rockefeller was given some poison, and he ordered him cremated right away from the telephone out in California. Dr. Bond is a very questionable character. I don't know why they need him on this case, except to keep increasing his bona fides and making him more prominent on these big national events that take place. So when you see his name there, you can know that there is more to the shuttle program, and as it develops, this is my 6th week on the shuttle program. It is a terribly big story, and it has many tentacles and links going back to the Kennedy assassination, which was a coup d'etat in this country, and developing through these various processes. And I believe what took place down there at Cape Canaveral was one more escalation of the Defense Department Star Wars maneuvers, and I'll be detailing that for weeks to come. Next week, I'm going to go into details about the Challenger, the deaths that Jesse Jackson cited in the Houston Post as possibly averting nuclear disaster, and cite all the reasons that I've listed on why this ship really didn't mean to survive. The shuttle program was designated to collapse as early as 1983, by September 83, and in an article called, a magazine called Space Flight in 1982 in May, there was a title, The Military Role of the Shuttle by Gerald L. Barrowman, and that sealed the death literally on the shuttle system. Its first espionage work, as I said, was in September 83. I'll detail that for you. And then all the things that were meant to go wrong, that would go wrong, it was a literal time bomb. But the scary part is the next ship was to have plutonium on it, and I'm going to detail the dangers of that. Jesse Jackson asked the question in this article, as I say, from the Houston Post, did their deaths avert a nuclear disaster? Explosion could wipe out all of Florida. And I think that is one of the possibilities on why, there's several, why this took place. But this could be like Scotch tape at the Watergate Hotel, where that Scotch tape broke open the COINTEL program, the MK Ultra program, the Tom Charles Houston program, the Defense Department plans for literally making a police state out of the United States. And if the plutonium went down, it's the most poisonous gas in the world, and went with the next shuttle, it could have affected everything on planet Earth, and certainly the part in Florida. And I'll do more on the plutonium, and also Bernard Goetz and his links to the space program and plutonium, and I'll update that for you. That is something to come next week. I'm just rushing through it now. The Monterey Herald had a story this morning, a syndicated column, or it's from news which goes around the country. Astronauts demand assurance of safety. And one of the astronauts, Mr. Young, John Young, now chief of NASA's astronaut office, was complaining about the safety of the shuttle, and many of you read the story. And he said that about the seals being uncertain, and he said there is only one driving reason that such a system, that such a potentially dangerous system would be allowed to fly. Now, that is a cover story. It is not true. There is not only one driving system that it would fly, specifically business or commercial reasons. If you had millions of dollars in that payload and in that ship, you wouldn't jeopardize it for the sake of 2 hours later of leaving in the afternoon. That is impossible. That it would be a business thing, because that would be bad business policies. And I've cited the switch from the civilian or the teacher in space to the military, and also now we're going into the severance of the military, taking care of the Star Wars and that part of space and the weapons, and the space shuttle will go into what they call commercialization, which is the privatization of space, which is what the Heritage Foundation recommended, and then it'll be like IG Farben, a private company running synthetic rubber, but the government, the Gestapo, sends them the slave labor, so that the factories are run by private business, but the manpower is sent by the government, so that the huge control of the space shuttle, the program, the commercialization, such as Rockwell, who wants to pay the entire $2.5 billion to replace this particular Challenger, and then you get the used aircraft and McDonnell Douglas and Boeing, and they will supply the machinery, and the businesses will be run by private business, such as, say, the Hughes Medical Institute, the DuPont Foundation. You'll give it to various businesses, such as DuPont, ITT, and the medical pharmaceutical laboratories, and then we're in real trouble. This ship was meant to destruct, and I believe that had it gone one more time, and I'll do more on this next week, on that cloud of plutonium particles that would have gone over into the southeast part of the country and then into the water there, if this had exploded on the next shuttle. And maybe the pushing of this, knowing that it could not survive all of the things that happened to it and that it was going to break down anyway, is an indication that somebody was aware of the dangers of the next one. If this one succeeded, it would be guaranteed that what I stated would happen by the next one. So I'll do some of that next week. I don't want to do that right now. Also, I wrote for Paul Krasner, his next realist. We are combining again. I did a short article this time. It's about 2,000 words on the links of the Korean airline 007 to the shuttle Challenger. The captain of the Challenger was Admiral Truly, Richard Truly, and he monitored the KAL as it went down with Larry McDonald on it. Then Richard Truly has now, Admiral Truly, has been put in charge of the shuttle program. If that sounds complicated for you, I'll detail more of it next week. Also give you an idea of the article I've done for Paul, and I suppose it'll be out in a month or two. Now, I want to give you 3 addresses. I hope you have your pencil ready. Get it ready, because there are 3 subscriptions to publications that you should be getting, or information that is available that is important to my research, and I can't put all of it on the air. There is a publication or a group called the Committee to Stop the Moral Majority and Fascism in San Francisco, and they have printed information on AIDS as a biological warfare, on the Rockefeller Foundation. They have a book that I've cited on the air before, Men Against Hitler, that is available, and a lot of material on Reverend Moon. I don't know what they are charging, if they will copy all this for you, but some of it is available. A newspaper on AIDS, and write to them, 495 Ellis Street, ELLIS Street, number 1271, San Francisco, California, 94102. This is the Committee to Stop Moral Majority, and they've changed their name, and Fascism, and they're investigating the Moonies in the Bay Area and the anti-gay groups, and they have a lot of valuable material to share. Another important publication to write to is called The Freedom Fighter. It's available through the American Information Network. I'm going to give it just once. If you don't get it right, you can call me or send a self-addressed stamped envelope, or you can send that and get a sheet that accompanies this broadcast, and I'll print it out for you. The Freedom Fighter, through the American Information Network, 2140 West Chapman Avenue, number 223, Orange, California, 92668. You can get 10 copies of this magazine. It's about 10 pages long for $3.50 on AIDS. And once you get it, I think you would like to get more to send to your friends. There's a quotation in there that I've seen quite a few times recently regarding AIDS. It's from Bertrand Russell, and he wrote a book called The Impact of Science on Society. And this is the quotation. At present, the population of the world is increasing at 58,000 per day. War so far has no great effect on the increase, which continued throughout each of the world wars. War has been disappointing in this respect, but perhaps bacteriological war may prove effective. If a Black Death could spread throughout the world once in every generation, survivors could procreate freely without making the world too full. The state of affairs might be unpleasant, but what of it? And this is important because of the way I believe that the space shuttle program is going to be given over to the process of developing AIDS and affecting crops, and I'll tell you why as I go on later in the evening. But this is something you should be sending for. The third thing you should send for is write to the National Education Association in care of the Instruction and Professional Development, 1201 16th Street, 1201 16th Street, Northwest, Washington, D.C., 20036, and ask for their book, Extremism in the United States, a teaching resource focusing on neo-Nazism. Now, Krista McAuliffe, the astronaut that went down in that shuttle, was president of the chapter of the NEA in New Hampshire. She was very liberal. She was pro-Kennedy and an outspoken person during the Peace March. And part of the organization that she was active in published this book in 1972 for teachers, and the contents includes the rise of National Socialism in Germany, the Nazi movement in the United States in the 30s, the American Nazi movement in the post-war World War II, the Rockwell connections, the neo-Nazi organizations today. This is a 200-page book. They don't have a price there. They sent it to me. You might send a contribution of a few dollars. It's about neo-Nazism, how people join, how they work in Europe, where they are in the United States, on anti-Semitism and prejudice. And they have copies of articles such as one in USA Today regarding Nazi leaflets left at school considered not a crime, and the story of that fellow Joseph Hoover who was murdered in Oroville, California. I wrote about an article about him in 1982, linked to the Nazi movement, and he's linked to, of course, the Manson family and the possibility that they were going to help Charles Manson escape from prison. The book, Extremism in the United States, on the cover has neo-Nazism, anti-Semitism, anti-pluralism, National Socialism, Skokie, racism, fascism, George Lincoln Rockwell, genocide, totalitarianism, and so forth. It has a large list of subjects, and Krista McAuliffe, as I say, was president of that chapter, and this is what the NEA has been publishing and getting out for the past years, and I wasn't aware of it until she passed away, and then somebody, a friend from Midwest, sent me this information, and I sent for that book. I'm going now into a subject away from the shuttle for just a few moments to something which I believe is very serious and important, and you're going to have to listen very carefully to get these connections, or you can send, as I say, for a bibliography of this program, and I will chart these out for you if you want to see them. This has to do with the exposure this past week of Kurt Waldheim, is having Nazi background. This came out March the 4th, 1986. His role in Greece and in Yugoslavia in 1940 to 1944. This investigation, according to the newspapers, has been going on since November of 1985 for the past 6 months, a little earlier, like September 85, until just when the story broke. So there was a 6-month investigation of Kurt Waldheim with documents to show his role with a high officer who was later hung as a war criminal in Greece and Yugoslavia, and that broke on the 4th. Now, just a few days before the story broke about Waldheim's connections, and Waldheim, I'm sure most of you know, was known mainly as the ambassador from Austria to the United Nations, and the rest of his past isn't well known, except that he started law school in 1944. According to, if you look up the almanacs, he was born in Austria, and he started law school in 44, and there's that big gap that we'll go into. Now, February 27, 1986, just 5 days before the story broke in the headlines about Kurt Waldheim, Lady Fleming passed away, a woman she lived in Greece. She married an Englishman, the doctor who discovered penicillin. She passed away. She was born in Greece, and from 1941 to 44, when the Nazis occupied Greece, she was very active in the resistance movement. She provided false documents to help Jews escape and others escape, and she was also active against our CIA Greek Nazi coup that the United States put in power in 1967. In 1971, she was arrested. She was held in jail for 16 months, not 6 months. And we, the United States, had a military dictatorship, 1967 to 1974. And she was in a military prison. Now, Lady Fleming had something in common with Kurt Waldheim. Their politics weren't in common, but they were in Greece at the same time period where he would be working with the Gestapo in that time period, with one of the most notorious leaders of the Gestapo in Greece. So they covered this time slot, 1941 to 44, in Greece together. And he was a Nazi, she was anti-Nazi, and she died, as I say, just 4 days before the story broke, but they'd been working on it for 6 months. Now, he's running for the president of Austria just at the time she dies. The election will be in May, and so if she saw that these papers came out of his role in Greece, because he was much younger then, and she was active in the underground, she very nicely would have made those connections. Now, March the 2nd, 1986, this past week, 2 days before the Waldheim Nazi connections broke, OLAF PALME in Sweden was gunned down. So Lady Fleming and PALME, one died of a heart attack in Greece on the 27th, and then 3 days later, OLAF PALME, the Prime Minister of Sweden, was gunned down. Now, PALME was very, very close, and I'll give some more details of his background. I briefly mentioned last week. He was very close to Dag Hammarskjöld. They're both from Sweden. They're both from the ruling upper class, the elite upper class. Dag Hammarskjöld was head of the United Nations for I'll give you the year time span. He was killed in 1961 on a peace mission over the Congo. But his father was Prime Minister of Sweden, a job that Olof Palme would have for 4 different elections. So the two men came from Sweden. Hammarskjöld, active in peace movements, identical to Olof Palme, and killed over the Congo. He was on the way down to the Congo, February the 12th, 1961. Patrice Lumumba was killed down there on February the 12th, 1961, pardon me. And 7 months later, Hammarskjöld is on the way down there to meet Mr. Chambe, and that was his mistake. He should have known when Patrice Lumumba was killed to stay away, but 7 months later he is willing, this peacemaker from Sweden, to visit with Mr. Chambe, and his plane was blown up or blown down, whichever way you want to see it. So Olof Palme was anti-fascist, Dag Hammarskjöld was anti-fascist. They both worked for peace movements, and they were visible to people all over the world, not just in their home area, for the things that they stood for. Now, the stories that broke about Kurt Waldheim, one was I got from the Houston Post from a good friend there, And I'm sure you saw most of your papers that now that he's a candidate for president in Austria, the stories linking him to General Alexander Lohr, Lohr, are in the news. Lohr was a man who committed tremendous atrocities. He ordered 42,000 Greek Jews to death camps and killed thousands of Yugoslavs. And Waldheim was in Yugoslavia and in Greece when this was going on. Waldheim did not deny his membership in the Brown Shirts, the Nazi SA. He was part of the Nazi Student Union, and he was active as a youth with the Nazis. And Mr. John Tagliabue, the same New York Times writer who's been covering the trial of Ajah, confronted Waldheim with the documents about his past that Lohr's staff from 1942 to 43, at the time of the military operations against Yugoslavia, partisans ordered mass deportations of Greek Jews, and they accused Waldheim of concealing his story and even suggested that the people who approved of him as the head of the United Nations used it as blackmail when he's UN secretary. The man accusing him of that, interestingly enough, is Edgar Bronfman, the Bronfman of the head of Permandex, a team that had been so successful in killing so many heads of states before under the Permandex organization. He's part of the World Jewish Congress, and now he's accusing Waldheim of being a Nazi after Permandex, that outfit that I've described so many times, was so successful in setting up assassination teams for other heads of states. So the story of Waldheim is out. There's a picture of him in the uniform. San Jose Mercury had it. I'm sure many of you have it. In 1943 at an airstrip with the Italian commanders, and he worked, as I say, between Yugoslavia and Greece. Now, the Jewish group, this World Jewish Congress, has a lot of information about him and the role that he worked as assistant when these 40,000 Jews were put at death camps, and his activities. They were sent from Greece to Auschwitz in Poland, and from Yugoslavia, the Nazi massacres were taking place about the citizens. So that Waldheim's past is all being aired. It's been quiet all this time. He's going to be president of Austria with our precious Helene von Damme over there. And if you look at your almanac for 1972 or any year you want, I looked up Kurt Waldheim, Secretary General of the United States. It said he was born in Lower Austria. He was a teacher. Waldheim earned a law degree at the University of Vienna in 1944. So he's born and then he has a law degree, and there's absolutely no past. But all the others described in there have a past. As a matter of fact, Dag Hammarskjold, and this is the important point, is that Waldheim succeeded Dag Hammarskjold. There was an interim in there where you thought became Secretary General of the United States. But that interim just allowed or made way after Dag Hammarskjold was dead for Waldheim to step in. The almanac describes Dag Hammarskjold, and he was a close friend of Olof Palme. He was born in Sweden, an aristocratic family. His father was prime minister during World War I. He went in the foreign ministry, and he was elected Secretary General in 1952. And the article goes on, he greatly... not the article, the almanac. He influenced his office and extended the scope of his UN office. He visited Peking in 1955. I'm sure that would be a no-no. And he ended his 1961 Congo mission in a plane crash where he died over northern Rhodesia. He created the International Peacekeeping Force in the Middle East, and I'll do more about him later. Now, of course, Simon Wiesenthal gets in the act. I've done many broadcasts on Wiesenthal and his Gestapo connections. The San Francisco Examiner, March 6th, has a story from Vienna. Nazi hunter Simon Wiesenthal says charges that former UN Secretary General Kurt Waldheim was a Nazi are untrue. Can you believe this? Yeah, I guess you can if you've heard me long enough. He questions how Waldheim became ignorant of mass deportation of Jews from Greece, and I'm sure that Mrs. Fleming wouldn't be ignorant of that. He said Wiesenthal, and the article goes on, Wiesenthal, whose documentation Center for Tracking Down Nazi War Criminals is based in Vienna, said yesterday there is nothing at all incriminating against Waldheim. According to what he read in the article in the New York Times, Wiesenthal made the statement to Austria's two major political parties. In other words, he's giving the Jewish kosher seal of approval. Waldheim is all right. And he said there's nothing incriminating about him. The New York Times reported his membership in these units and in the Wehrmacht unit in Greece when thousands of Jews were deported to Polish concentration camps. Now, in Simon Wiesenthal's book, he said he never looked for war criminals among the Wehrmacht and any part of the Nazi German army because they were only taking orders. He only studied members of the Gestapo. So if he wasn't in the Gestapo, if the Wehrmacht sent these 42 or 44,000 people to their death, that was okay. Wiesenthal said with an interview to the Jewish news agency that Waldheim never belonged to the Nazi Party or one of its branches. Can you believe that? 1941 to 44, working with this top general who was hung as a war criminal. And then all of a sudden, Wiesenthal says, he didn't know anything about it. He might have known some were deported, but he had nothing to do with it. Now, along those same lines are working with these same people is that notorious Nazi who's lived in California all these years, Mr. Arturkovich. He's been sent to Israel to stand trial. He's from Yugoslavia. He's been charged in killing 200,000 or more people as Minister of the Interior and Minister of Justice in Yugoslavia in the Nazi puppet state of Croatia from 1941 to 45. So that Mr. Waldheim went between Yugoslavia, where Arturkovich was responsible for these atrocities, to Greece, where these atrocities were taking place, and he still wants and will be the new head of the government in Austria. But I can't believe that Olaf Palme at this time wasn't certainly aware of what is going on. A story from the Kansas City Star, a listener sent to me. Trial will open a bloody chapter. This has to do with the Arturkovich trial. So with the Arturkovich connections to Yugoslavia and the Greek connections of Waldheim between the two areas going back and forth, and the 6-month investigation on Waldheim that broke with these facts about where he was and his place with these death squads, I'm wondering if Lady Fleming died and if Olaf Palme died because the elections in Austria are so important to the grand plan or scheme of things, and that they are knowledgeable about them and suffered or lived through these various experiences. The article about Lady Fleming from the New York Times, February 27th, describes her as a woman who was the foe of the Nazis and the army junta. And it describes Lady Fleming. She was the wife of the British scientist. Lady Fleming was a member of the Parliament and the Socialist Party of Prime Minister Andreas Papandreou. Described her as dying of a heart attack as a result of a kidney failure. She was 73. But the fact is that she was very active in this time period where Waldheim lived in her country. The article, the obituary says, a graduate of Athens University. She went to Britain and was married just a short time before her husband passed away. But she was born in Constantinople, raised in Greece. During the 1941-44 Nazi occupation of Greece, she joined the resistance movement. She helped provide supplies and information to the British, Australian, New Zealand officers, and she was helpful to the people who wanted to escape. And after the war, those very resistance people were gunned down and held like prisoners and dogs all over Europe and in Greece. And this article goes on how she helped Greek Jews to escape, and she was equally active with the military regime. As I said before, from 1967 to 74, she played a key role in Amnesty International. She returned back to Greece and worked with the Greek Committee of Amnesty. Covert Action, the magazine, the last issue, November 25th, winter 86, has a capsule history of Greece and the Nazis in it, and it describes from 1941 to 44, Greece is under Nazi occupation, and the armed resistance is carried out mainly by ELAS, E-L-A-S, which was the resistance movement. And as soon as the war was over, those people were the ones that were tortured and rounded up by the so-called Allied forces that got Greece liberated. And it seems that the Nazis, not only in France with Klaus Barbie, but all over the world, and also in Southeast Asia and Manchuria, and in Japan, the very top war criminals, and in China, Chiang Kai-shek, they began working with the fascists who did the crimes and forgot about the fact of the people who really wanted liberation. Interestingly enough, Covert Action describes the Greek military junta and their activities, but after the war, the Greek National Police in 1947, the year our CIA was formed, this article in Covert Action said, is that they had an instruction manual, 38 pages, which they used, and it told how they took corpses and went after the resistance movement at that time and decapitated their bodies, put the heads in sacks, and transported them for public viewing. This is described in a current book that came out, and I'll give you the title on the sheet, separate sheet that accompanies this broadcast, but it concludes the statement by saying, in 1947, Greece was a training ground for the newly created CIA for Vietnam, El Salvador, Nicaragua, and the Contras to come much later. We'll take a 1-minute break and then continue on this before I get to some of the shuttle complexities. This is Mae Brussell. After that 1-minute break, this is the second half of program 744. In the Houston Post, there was a brief comment about violence and the assassinations in Sweden, and the article said Palme's murder is Sweden's first major political assassination since Gustav III was killed in 1792, which plunged this country of 8 million into deep grief. Another article, a new witness describes possible Palme assassin, and the first attempt after he was murdered was trying to blame, as I mentioned last week briefly, the Red Army faction, the Holger Mines Commando, but on the other hand, they said the path of the bullet through the vertebrae, the main artery and windpipe, indicated the killer knew where to hit his victim. A story in the Monterey Herald and the Christian Science Monitor, March the 9th, on Palme's slang, it says the neo-Nazi terrorism is on the rise in Sweden, aimed primarily at the waves of immigrants who flooded the country in recent years. Stockholm has already been the scene of racially motivated battles. At present, 1/10 of the population is foreign-born, and the children are, every fourth child is foreign extraction. Here the motives may be clearer. Palme had strongly backed the immigration policy, but so far the Swedish neo-Nazi groups so far have no record of murder, but they don't have to be Swedish neo-Nazi groups. You remember Ali Majan, his links to Nazis in Turkey and in Germany. Instead of the German left, they are catching on that there are these Nazi groups in Sweden. Another story, March the 9th, in the Monterey Herald, about searching for this assassin. They said they have contact with a person who received an anonymous letter with interesting information about his death. The clues they're following seriously. In the meanwhile, a Turkish newspaper printed the photograph of a fugitive Kurdish militant they said was a suspect in the Palme killing. They released one suspect from Germany, and they have released one from Yugoslavia that they had last week. But they've been told that the Kurdish activists and some Turkish participants might have been involved. Both bullets were sent to West Germany Federal Police for identification, which is another mistake, and they're convinced that this was well planned in advance. Well, they had 6 months to plan it if there was a 6-month investigation on Mr. Kurt Waldheim, and it wouldn't take that long to plan the particular murder. It'll be interesting to see the links to, if it's linked to the Turkish fascists and that element, because Robert Keith Gray, the public relations office that is the right hand of Ronald Reagan, represents the country of Turkey, that military dictatorship. It's an extension of William Casey's CIA, similar to the Mullen Associates I've cited. It's just part of the Central Intelligence Agency. The CIA wants Waldheim to be head of Austria without any idea of an alternate or more liberal person there, and Elaine von Damme, a protege of Otto von Bolschwing from that same territory, is situated in Austria, and I'm sure that the leads to somebody from Turkey or that part would be very interesting. They are suspecting, because of certain information, that this could be a fact. Another story, police find the bullet that killed Palme. Political motives linked to slang. You better believe it's political. And another article, rare bullets, a powerful gun used by killer, fuel speculation. He was a professional hitman, and this special kind of a gun is a type. It's the most powerful that you can have. It penetrates a bulletproof vest, a very complicated weapon, it seems, and a special kind of a gun. Michael Harrington wrote an article in the LA Times, Olaf Palme, Socialism was a moral passion, and he described having dinner one evening with West German Chancellor Willy Brandt. Next to Brandt sat Michael Manley, the former Prime Minister of Jamaica, who's out, and Agapati Aquino, the brother of the slain Filipino Philippine opposition leader Benigno Aquino. So Olaf Palme, Willy Brandt, Michael Manley, and Mr. Aquino, the brother of the late Benigno Aquino. Palme joked about his days as youth movement. He talked about disarmament. He thought disarmament could free funds for a truly concerted effort to end poverty in the Third World. For him, the personal, the moral, and the political were of a piece. And that, of course, is the biggest stumbling block to poverty all over the world, is the making of the weapons. Anthony Lewis wrote a nice tribute to Olaf Palme. He quotes him as saying, "Complacency is a terrible danger. A politician shouldn't say anything's fine. He should talk about what's wrong. In Sweden, we can be happy about not having the excitement of some of these other countries and their race problems, but there is a risk for us, and you have to activate people." And Anthony Lewis went on to say that he emphasized that Sweden should be a caring society where people have a responsibility for each other. And back in 1969, he wanted to make Sweden more aware of the world, and he did in an extraordinary extent. He was known around the world for his efforts on behalf of arms control and peace, of economic development. He was chairman of the Independent Commission on Disarmament and Security Issues. He had important figures from 17 countries, including the United States and the Soviet Union, and he had a consensus about sensitive issues of national power. And in 1982, he had a report, Common Security That Remains a Model of Reason. One noteworthy aspect of the report was that the Soviet Union agreed to call for an on-site inspection if needed to verify compliance with arms control agreements. Last year, he joined 5 other heads of government around the world in calling for a reversal of nuclear arms race. Before the Geneva meeting, they urged Reagan and Gorbachev to suspend nuclear tests for a year and negotiate a comprehensive test ban treaty. Mr. Gorbachev has done it, and our warfare state has not done it, and I know that they have to be related to the murder of Olaf Palme, who has an idea different than those in power who now control the guns and the means of wiping these people out. This Anthony Lewis article goes on, Palme did not act as an individual in those international efforts. He made his people care. He showed that a small country on the fringe, long committed to neutrality, could become deeply committed as a society to international goals, justice, freedom, compassion, and survival. He is internationally engaged, his successor, Mr. Ingvar Carlsson, on scientific and environmental questions, and he will continue the efforts that Palme made. And then the bottom of the article says, the terrible irony is he died by unreasoning violence. No death since John Kennedy's has been more fearful witness of the kind of world that this has become. And I think Indira Gandhi, of course, is another leader gunned down in the same way, and Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King. But Olaf Palme has left us an example of his caring. And this is by Anthony Lewis, a very nice article. Now, the day of the ceremonies for Olaf Palme, there is a picture in the newspaper of Edward Kennedy, Senator Edward Kennedy, attending the services, and across from the picture is Barbara Bush, it quotes, appearing to weep. And the most nauseating thing about this whole picture and the article is that among those mourners was Henry Kissinger, a target of Palme's criticism of the U.S. war effort in Vietnam. Barbara Bush, the wife of Vice President Bush, attended the funeral. George Bush, the former director of the CIA, with the blood of Orlando Letelier and Ronnie Moffett dripping from his hands when he was director of CIA and they were killed in Washington, he was in Tunisia with the Assistant Undersecretary of State Richard Murphy. He met Saturday with Tunisian President Habib Bourguiba to discuss the future of Tunisia. George Bush goes to Mr. Bourguiba's the day that Olaf Palme is being buried and doesn't have the decency to show up, and then sends Henry Kissinger, who's the antithesis of every single thing that Olaf Palme stood for or Dag Hammarskjold stood for. And then to ice that lousy, filthy cake was an article with William Buckley, March the 9th, Olaf Palme, and he goes on to say there's something appealing. Now listen to this as against the Anthony Lewis article. If he doesn't like him, he shouldn't talk about him this way right when the body's being buried. varied. He says, there's something appealing about Olof Palme, even if he did his best during his long career to make Sweden uninhabitable. After finishing Kenyon College in Ohio, young Palme visited 34 American cities in search of poverty. It didn't take long to find it. He realized that from this, the richest country in the world, there's poverty. He drew his devotion to socialism that he nurtured in Sweden. James Burnham once remarked about Mrs. Roosevelt that she turned all her world into a personal slum project. This is William Buckley, who formed Young Americans for Freedom with Charles Willoughby from the German Freikorps, Mr. Wiedenbach his name is, with Ronald Reagan and Robert Morris, and that Young American for Freedom gang that came in from Munich, Germany, to Dallas as of June to November '62 and played a role in the murder of John Kennedy. This glib, rotten William Buckley is saying these things, turning Sweden into something uninhabitable. He said Olof Palme, the friend of the common man, marched alongside North Vietnamese ambassador to the Soviet Union to protest American armed colonialism in South Vietnam. Then Palme, the brilliant intellectual straight-A student, denounced the carpet bombing of Hanoi, in which fewer than 300 people were killed and which precipitated the peace initiative of 1972, denouncing the United States as being on a par with Nazis and who were behind the bombing of Guernica in 1937. Now, Fritz Kramer was the man in charge, the German Fritz Kramer, in charge of the Vietnam operations as plans officer of the Pentagon. That was Kramer's job. And Henry Kissinger, the German, ordered the bombing of Hanoi and Cambodia. That was their job, to drop those bombs. It doesn't matter how 300 or 600. It is compared to the Nazis because they were Nazis, and that is the truth of the matter, that the Nazis from Germany took over in our Pentagon policies and did those things. And then this is just the final conclusion of William Buckley, and if I sound angry, I am really angry. He said the death that greeted Palme was in a way a testimonial to his idealism. Why would anyone want to kill Palme, especially in Sweden, when 12 hours before he died, he dismissed his bodyguards? Now isn't that dumb? Why would anyone want to kill him when he dismissed his bodyguards? That's when you kill somebody. That you don't kill them while they have the bodyguards. He said there are those who feel that if he had to depart the world suddenly, it would be better if he died of radioactivity or by a submarine than by navigational error, or landed on Swedish Parliament rather than in a Swedish fjord, as if that makes sense. But his death was a personal tragedy and must be focused on discreetly, even as his life was a public tragedy. I said last week that I thought Robert Dornan's calling Mr. Posner a traitorous Jew, a slimy, traitorous Jew, was done on purpose on ABC, and you better be listening a little more and reading a little bit more about what these people who have access to the White House night and day are saying. Imagine writing an article that his life was a personal tragedy. And just a few words about Dag Hammarskjöld. I read you a section. He was in the United Nations from 1953 to 1961, and then there was that little interim where U Thant took over, and then Mr. Waldheim from the Greek Nazis and the Yugoslavian Nazis, the most treacherous kind of activity, becomes the head of the United Nations. The U Thant period is similar to the Lyndon Johnson period between Kennedy's murder and when Nixon took over, or the period when Carter was an interim between Gerald Ford of the Warren Commission and Ronald Reagan. There's a little time filler to get ready for the proper succession of office till they get in who they want. So when Dag Hammarskjöld is murdered in 1961, very shortly after that, with a time period by U Thant, in comes Kurt Waldheim. I have a lot of books, 3 or 4 books, on the death of Dag Hammarskjöld and his poetry books. Also, one book, The Last Days of Dag Hammarskjöld, by Arthur Gavshon, is a good one. It tells about his peace mission in the Congo and describes September 18th, 1981, as his plane went down and his mission for peace ended in disaster. He had an appointment with Chambé. I said that was his mistake. The cause of the crash has baffled experts of every land, including the special investigation team set up by Rhodesia and the United Nations. I'm sure that Mr. Waldheim, representing Austria at the time, was very anxious to find out what happened. This book asks the question, could it have been a mere accident that struck such a man at such a time? Was the airplane that carried him sabotaged and shot down by some assassin? So many crushing political problems and conflicting pressures have lately been bearing down on Hammarskjold in his lonely struggle for peace and understanding that worldwide tributes to the man were inevitably tinged with consternation and suspicion when he went down, and that's described as personal heroism. Also, another book, Champion of World Peace, Dag Hammarskjold, by I.E. Levine, and this is a expose also of what happened to him and the tragedy of his death and his guidance of peace missions throughout the world while he lived, and as Secretary General. And he said, who is this man that the whole world mourned? They mourned Hammarskjold. He worked closely with Olaf Palme. Palme was aware of Hammarskjold's death, I'm sure, and the scandals that within the last 6 months that Mr. Waldheim was going to have to stand up to and that he would pass along. Now, I say the big mistake was that Dag Hammarskjold went down to the Congo to meet Mr. Chambe. And in case you don't have it, you might write to the government printing office and get that book, The Alleged Assassination Plots Involving Foreign Leaders, put out by our own government, Investigations in 1975. And in there are details of the plans to kill Patrice Lumumba. As I say, when he died in 1961, February 61, Dag Hammarskjold went down to the Congo in 7 months later in 61 to meet with Mr. Chambe. And I'll do more on this later if you want. The people involved in the murder of Lumumba, Mr. Alan Dulles of the CIA, who was later put on the Warren Commission, Mr. Bissell, and the various networks of assassination teams that killed Lumumba, also then went on later after 1961, came back to the United States, and had a part in killing John Kennedy. So the tragedy in Europe, I believe, and in Greece of Mrs. Fleming dying at this time has to do with what they each knew about Mr. Waldheim, about his activities in Austria, and also he was in law school in 1944 when Hitler was in his heyday in Austria, and in Yugoslavia and Greece, and that these two world leaders had to be taken away at this time to assure the election or the confirming of the data of Waldheim's background so that in May he can become the president of Austria. If you hear a background with this tape, there is a heavy rainstorm hitting the windows, and it sounds like a hissing if you play it back. There's nothing wrong with the broadcast equipment, but we have to continue taping, and the rainstorm is very bad. By the time you get this, it'll be spring somewhere, but it is pouring in California on March the 10th, 1986. Now, I mentioned several weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, on World Watchers, Ronald Reagan's State of the Union or speech to Congress about his asking for money for the disease AIDS. He spoke specifically about AIDS, and he was anxious to find what he called a focus on the prevention of AIDS. The San Francisco Examiner 3 days later had an article, Drastic Measure in Disputed AIDS Studies, and this has to do with the Hoover Institute, closely functioning and related both to Edward Teller, and this is important, and Ronald Reagan, and they are requesting money for AIDS to study that could lead to biological and chemical warfare. And I also went into that broadcast about Howard Hughes Aircraft distributing $1 billion in the next few years, 5 years, for the areas of genetics, immunology, and neuroscience. The danger of Hughes Aircraft, of Hoover Institute, and Ronald Reagan zeroing in on AIDS. And I also mentioned that the shuttle Discovery, the one that Judith Resnick was on, previously was used for research on AIDS up in space there, and that she came from the National Institute of Health, spent years there, and got a degree there, so that the shuttle program, the Hughes Institute of Funding Immunology, the Reagan accentuation of AIDS in his State of the Union message, and the Hoover Institute coming out at the same time, the same week, was a very dangerous thing, and we should be observing it. And I also am concerned of it because of the threat to the immune system that is linked to the advanced genetic sciences, the group that want to spray out here in Monterey County their live genetic bacteria. So, and the next week on program number 742, I continued into the links of those people from the Hoover Institute to the Pentagon and the distribution of the money, $1 billion, from the Hughes Institute, and did a broadcast almost just on those two items, the Hoover Institute and the Howard Hughes, that would be funding and giving out to various people around the country money for experimentations and medical hanky-panky. I don't know what all they would be doing, but I have a pretty good idea. And then I cited the San Francisco Chronicle article, June 22nd, 1984. A spaceship, a shuttle Discovery, takes off next week with secret drug aboard as a shuttle, and said that it involved Charles Walker and experiments, and that they turned out to be experiments on AIDS. Now, along with that article I cited on the Hughes Medical Institute that I got from one paper, there's another article in the Houston Post that was sent to me March the 2nd, titled Hughes Medical Institute in a New Phase. Now, the similarity between the shuttle program went into a new phase. The shuttle disaster was part of the new program, and the Medical Institute, and this is an article about their handing out their money, and they said they've been secretive as Howard Hughes. They're now going to give money to Baylor College of Medicine, which we know they've done. Their headquarters were moved from Coconut Grove, Florida, to Bethesda, Maryland. And under the new spending program, the Hughes Institute will employ 900 researchers at 22 laboratories, and they will be funding Baylor in Houston, the University of Texas, Southwestern Medical School in Dallas. At Baylor, which leases out space for 10 Hughes investigators, they will be researching genetics and immunology, which I told you. Baylor will get $30 million for next 5 years. Dallas Southwestern will get $20 million in 5 years. The man distributing the money for the Hughes Medical Institute is Henry Kuss, K-U-S-S, a former deputy assistant with the Defense Department, who hands out this money. He says the Hughes Institute is not a private foundation, and he goes on to say that they will be distributing this money. And I mentioned before the immunology, but I didn't know when I cited their distribution of money and the key points that the money from Hughes Aircraft goes to the Medical Institute, and they've now sold that to General Motors for $5 million or so. So all of that money and interest goes right to the Medical Institute, and then they hand it out. And the distribution of it there in Texas is a former deputy assistant with the Defense Department. Now, the two frightening things that were in the newspaper this week, well, there were two articles, again from Houston Post. NASA funds tied to biotechnology. And this is one of the stories. Houston is trying to win NASA funding for space research, this time to establish a space biotechnology center. Now, Mr. Moore, Jesse Moore, who gave the go signal for the shuttle to go up, and when it exploded, he was moved, hired 5 days before the shuttle launched this time, to become head of the Houston Space Center, the Johnson Space Center in Houston. And this story goes on that there's going to be a space biotechnology center, that the government will do funding up to $3.7 million for 5 years and coordinate the biotechnology research. Now, it goes on to say that the purpose of their work will be under a former astronaut, Walter Cunningham, the head of Capital Cities Group, a venture capital city that says that under conditions of space, they can open up their opportunities for new research involving genetic engineering, strengthening crops, or understanding human disease. Now, those are the three factors of advanced genetic sciences that I was concerned about, with their offices in Belgium and Sweden and in Canada, and the Max Planck Institute in Germany, putting money into California with Mr. Adams from the offices of Sullivan and Cromwell becoming the head of the Oakland offices and setting it up. Capital's Group will be run by an astronaut, a former astronaut, to head it up, where they will do genetic engineering, strengthen crops, and understanding human disease at the same time. Now, if you were spraying a bunch of Mexicans here and testing their immune system, at the same time you're making the strawberry crops get stronger, and you're putting live genetic bacteria on it, you'd fill just about all those shoes. And the important thing is this Houston group, they call themselves the Grenada Corps, if you'll pardon the expression. It's a technical group that will use biotechnology to improve food production, and one of the largest firms in biotechnology field agreed to be the founding industry partner. They have a partner. And they're going to be in Houston, and the money will come to the same groups or team that the Hughes Medical Institute is doling out the money. Another story from the Houston Post for February the 20th. City sees its future in space. Houston suffered a blow when the proposal for a NASA center for commercial development of space failed to make it. At the time they felt like they were defeated. With space commercialization, the key component of the city's drive, they have lost prestige, but they will be back in business with a new, improved bid. Last year, winners for the University Business Laboratories were from Alabama, at Huntsville, Alabama, and in Birmingham and Vanderbilt University, and Jackson, Mississippi, the same places where the Hughes money is going. But under the Grenada Corporation, they're going to start working with NASA. The article says congressmen attending a breakfast in Clear Lake last week appeared more concerned about the impact of Graham-Rudman haulings on the NASA budget than the Challenger accident, Cunningham said. The deficit reduction would force a $322 million cut in the space agency $7.6 million budget. So the only thing they could do is go into the commercialization center of space. Now, what is going to happen is the Heritage Foundation wrote a proposal on the space program becoming commercialized, and they want to turn it over to private people to work with immune system, with food, with human disease. And this is so dangerous, as I said before. This is like I.G. Farben running Auschwitz or Poonemun, making rockets and bringing in the Gestapo, bringing in the workers to die. I believe that the Space Shuttle Challenger, now that it has gone down, is the excuse to privatize the program. Now, Rockwell, the former head of Rockwell International, I forget his first name, Mr. Rockwell, has offered to give a new $2.5 billion to the space shuttle. He doesn't need Congress. They don't need Congress, and they will commercialize it. So with unlimited billions, they can make any disease or use these commercial parts of it for killing people in the world, just like the Hoover Institute said there'll be 10 to 20 million dead within the next 10 years of AIDS. The commercialization was first described by the Heritage Foundation in a report called Slashing the Deficit Fiscal 87, a proposal by the staff of the Heritage Foundation for the budget of the U.S. government, and they called for paring the shuttle program by $500 million and beginning to privatize NASA by requiring the project's fifth shuttle be built by a private sector. But having that fourth destroyed, they can now pull in that, and already the private sector, a business, has offered to build that shuttle. They said there is a real danger to further subsidizing and monopolizing activities of NASA that could be put into, and this is for the Star Wars activity, they want to put it into that trans-atmospheric vehicle, which I told you Reagan promoted. That is another Star Wars type of plane to get to Japan in 2 hours. So what they're saying is turn the space shuttle program into private laboratories and privatize the space program, and that is exactly the script that is happening. Heritage wrote it up, and Mr. William Graham, who ordered the shuttle to go but wasn't even present at the launch, is a member of the Heritage Foundation, and by losing this one shuttle, all the problems and all the malfunctioning of the shuttle program come out, and now it can be in private hands where there's absolute secrecy off of planet Earth, where they will work on, in quotes, the immune system, on food production and disease. That is the whole team that was working at Auschwitz on understanding disease under Joseph Mengele, not the food, but the crop, the food crop, and the dusting, and the effect on the immune system. I believe AGS is going to work out in California. They refuse to test it anywhere else in the world except Monterey, and that was decided in Europe and in New England and in Pennsylvania that it would be Monterey and Monterey only. And as I said before, they've acknowledged this past week that it does affect the immune system and makes people sick, can make them sick, and those are the farm workers, and it can also travel through the air, through animals and birds. I have to do more on this next week on the tragedy of the shuttle and the manipulation of it, which I thought all along was purposeful for Star purposes. But besides isolating the Star Wars and putting all the money into the Star Wars and that trans-atmospheric vehicle, then the private people get the space for their own laboratories. And then we have Gerard O'Neill's plans for Alternative 3 that have been planned since World War II. These recent articles are really scary to see how nicely it all fits together and how they've come up front with their new plans just at the time the shuttle went down. Now, I've given a lot of material. I had enough for 3 or 4 more hours. I always do. But we have to settle for this 1 hour and finish now. This is Mae Brussell, and I'll be back with you next week. And thank you for these wonderful articles that are coming my way that I can share with all of you.